The wind howled a mournful tune through the skeletal pines, stripping warmth from the thin air and piling snow higher against the cabin door. Silas drew his threadbare blanket tighter around his shoulders, the chill having seeped through the walls hours ago. Hunger was a familiar ache in his gut, a dull companion to the gnawing solitude that was the true constant of his life here in the remote, unforgiving woods. He was a man carved from the same harsh landscape, lean and weathered, with hands calloused from axe and saw, and eyes that held the quiet, weary resignation of one who asked little from the world and received even less. His cabin, a small, rough-hewn box, offered scant protection, its hearth often cold for lack of fuel or strength to gather it. Every day was a negotiation with survival, a test he passed by the narrowest of margins. He had come here seeking only to be left alone with his grief, to lose himself in the trees, but the woods had offered no solace, only indifference and hardship. The silence was often broken only by the groan of timbers, the shriek of the wind, or the distant cry of some unseen creature. It was a silence that pressed in, amplifying his isolation until it felt like a physical weight. Then the smell came, faint at first, a wisp carried on the wind, alien to the clean, cold scent of snow and pine. Smoke, not the thin curl from a hearth, but something thicker, sharper, bearing the acrid tang of burning pitch and something else, something horrifyingly final. It grew, a dark smudge against the pale gray sky in the distance, beyond the ridge that marked the edge of his small, known world. A fire. In this weather, in this season, miles from any settlement, it defied understanding. A terrible unease settled over him, displacing the familiar ache of hunger and cold. It wasn't his concern, he told himself. Let the woods burn. What did it matter to him? But a deeper, more fundamental instinct pulled at him, a sense of something profoundly wrong. Leaving the meager warmth of his cabin felt like madness, risking scarce energy on a futile curiosity. Yet, he pulled on his stiff, frozen boots, wrapped a length of scavenged cloth around his face against the biting wind, and stepped out into the snow-choked landscape. The trek was arduous, each step a struggle against the drifts. He pushed forward, the scent of smoke growing stronger, more sickening, guiding him. Over the ridge, the full horror came into view. Not the woods, but a dwelling or what remained of one. A small, isolated cabin, now a smoldering ruin, timbers collapsed inward, smoke billowing from the embers like a dying breath. Desolation hung heavy in the air, a silence more profound than the wood's own. It was clear no one could have survived inside that inferno. But then, a faint sound, barely audible above the crackling remnants of the fire and the wind's lament. A whimper. He scrambled closer, heart hammering against his ribs with a sudden, sharp fear. Tucked beneath the meager overhang of a charred, standing wall, huddled together as if for warmth against the impossible cold, were two small forms. Children, filthy, smoke-blackened, barely clad, but alive. Twins, judging by their size and shape. Their faces, streaked with soot and tears, were turned into each other, small hands fisted in the fabric of their singed clothes. They shivered violently, their breath misting faintly in the frigid air. The sight hit Silas with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. Two children, here, alone, saved from fire only to face the gnawing cold and the unforgiving wild. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through his usual numbness. What was he to do? He had nothing. No food to spare, no warmth beyond his own frail cabin, no means to care for these fragile, unexpected lives. He, who struggled daily to keep himself alive, was suddenly responsible for two others. The sheer impossibility of it threatened to buckle his knees. Despair, a deeper, colder despair than any he had known before, washed over him. But looking at their small, trembling forms, the instinct that had driven him across the snow took over. He had to try. Carefully, he knelt, his voice a rough whisper against the wind. "Children," he said, the word foreign on his tongue. They flinched, but didn't cry out, too frozen, too stunned. He reached out a hand, hesitant. "Come?" Come with me. It's cold. It was a fragile offering, this rough woodsman's hand to their small, wounded world. He scooped them up, one under each arm, their weight surprisingly light, skeletal even. Their bodies were cold to the touch, shivering uncontrollably against his rough coat. Back across the ridge he stumbled, the return journey feeling infinitely longer, the weight of the children compounded by the weight of responsibility. He kicked open his cabin door, the interior feeling even colder and darker after the stark white glare of the snow. Inside, he set them gently on the floor near the cold hearth. They huddled together instinctively, eyes wide, darting around the unfamiliar, sparse room, taking in the rough log walls, the single cot, the meager table. They were silent save for their ragged breathing and the continued trembling. He needed fire immediately, scrabbling for the flint and tinder. His hands fumbled, clumsy with urgency. He coaxed a small flame to life amongst the precious, dry kindling he had saved, adding small pieces of wood slowly, building the fire gradually. As warmth began to spread, he knelt beside them. Their faces were identical under the grime, delicate features, large, terrified eyes of an uncertain color. He managed to murmur, Alara and Finn, guessing their names from some half-remembered fairy tale, needing to call them something, anything, to make them real, to make them theirs. They didn't respond, didn't correct him. Perhaps they had forgotten their own names. He had a little dry jerky, a hard biscuit. He broke off small pieces, offering them hesitantly. They stared at the food for a moment, then Alara, the slightly bolder one, reached out a tentative hand and took a piece. Finn followed suit. They ate slowly, deliberately, their small jaws working carefully. Days blurred into a cycle dictated by the demands of these two small, unexpected lives. Silas learned their needs through observation, through trial and error. Keeping them warm was a constant struggle. He burned through his carefully hoarded woodpile at an alarming rate, forcing him out into the punishing cold more frequently to chop more, each trip draining his strength. Food was even scarcer. His traps yielded little in the deep snow, and his own meager stores dwindled rapidly. He found himself giving them the larger portions, watching their thin faces intently as they ate, feeling a strange, fierce protectiveness bloom in his chest, a stark contrast to the despair that had first seized him. They rarely spoke, their voices tiny, raspy from smoke. They communicated through small sounds, hesitant gestures, the way they instinctively clung to his side when he was near. Alara, with her slightly darker hair, was more watchful, her eyes following his movements around the cabin. Finn, fairer, was quieter, often burying his face against Alara's shoulder or Silas's leg. He washed them as best he could with melted snow and precious, lukewarm water, revealing skin bruised and smudged but surprisingly unmarked by the fire itself. They smelled faintly of smoke still, a scent that seemed to cling to them like a second skin. He gave them his cot, sleeping himself on the floor near the dying embers of the fire, waking frequently to check on them, to add another precious log, to simply listen to their quiet breathing in the dark. Loneliness had been his companion before, a hollow space within him. Now, the cabin felt less empty, yet the silence was more profound, filled with the unspoken anxieties of three souls huddled against the vast, indifferent world. He taught them small things: how to identify the tracks of animals in the snow, how to tell if the fire was safe to approach, the names of the few objects in the cabin. They watched him with unwavering attention, their eyes holding a depth of understanding that surprised him. Trust grew slowly, like a fragile vine in barren soil. Finn began to reach for his hand when they walked outside for brief, frigid moments. Alara would lean against him while he mended his clothes or sharpened his axe. Small, quiet gestures that spoke volumes. Silas found himself talking to them, recounting simple stories of the woods, describing the birds and animals he rarely saw anymore, his voice rough but gentle. He told them of the spring that would eventually come, of the green leaves and the warmer sun, painting a picture of a world beyond their current, cold reality, a world he wasn't sure he would ever see again with them. He worried constantly. worried about food, about illness, about someone discovering them. Who were they? Where were their parents? The questions lingered unanswered, a dark cloud on the horizon. He knew he couldn't keep them here indefinitely. This was not a life for children. But the thought of them leaving, of the cabin returning to its former empty silence, sent a sharp ache through him that was new and unwelcome. He had found something unexpected in their presence, a purpose beyond mere survival, a quiet warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. He had become, in his own rough, inadequate way, their protector, their provider. And they, in turn, had filled a void he hadn't realized was so vast. His resilience, tested daily by poverty and solitude, was now harnessed to the fierce, unwavering need to keep these two safe. It was a heavy burden, but one he carried with a quiet determination that felt strangely like strength. The day the sound arrived was like any other, cold, gray, the wind sighing through the trees. Silas was outside, attempting to clear a path through a particularly deep drift near the cabin, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Ilara and Finn were inside, playing quietly with a handful of smooth stones he had found for them. He heard it faintly at first, a distant, unfamiliar sound, muffled by the snow and the wind. A rhythmic clatter, a muffled jingling. It grew louder, clearer, approaching his hidden corner of the woods. It was the sound of horses, many of them, and something heavy being pulled. Not the sound of the solitary trapper or the occasional lumber wagon. This was different. His heart seized in his chest, a cold dread spreading through him. Who would come this far? Why? He dropped his shovel, scrambling towards the cabin, urging the children inside, away from the small window. He barred the door, his mind racing. Was it the law? People searching for the children? But how would they know? Unless someone had survived the fire, someone who knew where they were. The sound stopped just outside the small clearing where his cabin stood. A moment of silence, thick with anticipation. Then, footsteps crunching on the snow, voices, sharp and clear, cutting through the quiet of the woods. And then, the sight that made his breath catch in his throat. Through the cracks in the rough-hewn door he saw it. Not a rough wagon or a sleigh, but a carriage. A magnificent, enclosed carriage, painted a deep, gleaming gold, pulled by 4 perfectly matched, high-stepping horses adorned with polished brass fittings. Servants in livery stood attending to the horses and opening the carriage door. Stepping out onto the snow was a woman. She was tall, cloaked in rich, dark fabric trimmed with fur, her movements precise, almost regal. Her face, framed by a hood, was pale, her eyes scanning the rude cabin with an intensity that sent a shiver down Silas's spine. She looked utterly out of place in this desolate wilderness, like a jewel dropped carelessly in the mud. She spoke to one of the men, gesturing towards the cabin. The man approached the door, knocking sharply. Silas hesitated, frozen between the instinct to protect the children and the knowledge that he could not hide them forever, especially not from this. The knocking came again, louder, more insistent. He exchanged a look with Ilara and Finn, who clung to his legs, their faces pale with fear, mirroring his own. He saw the trust in their wide eyes, the implicit plea for safety. With a slow, deliberate movement, he unbarred the door and pulled it open, shielding the children with his body. He stood there, a figure of rough wood and worn cloth against the backdrop of his humble cabin, facing the opulence and authority assembled before him. The woman's gaze fell upon him, assessing, sharp. Her eyes, he saw now, were the same striking color as Ilara's, a clear, piercing blue. "You," she said, her voice low, controlled, yet carrying an undeniable weight of command. "You are the one who found them." She stepped forward, her eyes moving past him to the 2 small figures huddled behind his legs. A soft gasp escaped her lips, and for a fleeting moment, the rigid control on her face faltered, revealing a raw, deep-seated pain and relief. It was clear, undeniably clear. This was their mother. The air crackled with unspoken questions, with the stark juxtaposition of their 2 worlds meeting here in the silent, snowy woods. The woman's gaze fixed on the children, then lifted to meet Silas's eyes, a complex mixture of emotions swirling in their depth, pain, relief, and a guarded curiosity. "Alara, Finn," she breathed, her voice trembling slightly despite its practiced composure. It was their names. His guess had been right. He stepped back slightly, allowing her to see them fully. Alara and Finn peered out from behind his legs, their initial fear warring with a hesitant recognition, drawn by the sound of the familiar names spoken in a voice they must have known. The woman sank to her knees on the snow, heedless of her rich clothes, holding out her arms. "My darlings," she whispered, and the formal facade cracked fully, revealing the desperate heart of a mother. The children hesitated for a moment, looking back at Silas as if for permission or reassurance. Then they ran to her, burying themselves in her embrace. The sound of their small, muffled sobs and her soft, weeping murmurs filled the quiet clearing. Silas stood back, watching the reunion, feeling a strange, complex mix of emotions, relief that they were claimed, sorrow at their imminent departure, and a quiet sense of completion. After several long minutes, the mother composed herself, rising slowly, keeping the children close to her side. She introduced herself with quiet dignity, though her name was one Silas vaguely recognized as belonging to a family of significant wealth and standing. The children, now clinging to her, looked different already, somehow softer, less wild, bathed in the warmth of her presence. "My home. There was a fire," she explained, her voice low and measured. "I was away. My staff. Only one survived, badly injured. He managed to send word days later. He said he thought he saw them escape towards the woods before he was overcome. We have been searching since." Desperately, she looked at Silas, her expression shifting to one of profound gratitude. "You saved them. You kept them safe, here, in this wilderness." Her gaze swept over the humble cabin, the sparse surroundings, then back to him, his worn clothes, his lean frame, a man clearly living on the edge of existence. How did you manage?" Silas, finding his voice, kept it simple, devoid of self-pity or embellishment. "I found them. They were cold. They were hungry. I did what I could." He didn't speak of his own hardship, the gnawing hunger, the constant cold, the fear. It was unnecessary. The woman understood. She saw the care etched on his face, in the way the children still occasionally glanced towards him. She saw the sacrifice his meager existence must have entailed to support 2 extra lives. "You have a debt that cannot be repaid with mere coin," she said, her gaze steady. "But I must try to express my gratitude, and ensure you are not left in want for your kindness." She signaled to one of her men, who approached carrying a heavy, leather-bound pouch. "This," she said, extending it to him, "is a beginning. It will see you through many winters. But more than that, I want to ensure you are cared for. My estate is vast. There is work, a small cottage, security. If you wish it, I will not leave you to struggle alone after you have done this for us." Silas took the pouch, its weight unfamiliar and startling in his hand. It was more money than he had seen in his entire life. He looked from the pouch to the woman, to the children clinging to her skirts. He thought of the silent, empty cabin, the endless struggle with the woods. The offer was more than generous. It was an escape, a future, but something held him back. He had found a different kind of wealth here, a connection forged in shared vulnerability and quiet care. He didn't belong in grand houses or structured estates. "Your offer is more than kind," he said, his voice rough with emotion he struggled to contain. "The children, they are safe. That is the reward." He looked at Alara and Finn. "They are good children. Strong." A small smile touched his lips, the first genuine smile the woman had likely seen there. The time came for them to leave. The children, bundled in warm cloaks provided by the servants, looked back at Silas as they were guided towards the golden carriage. Alara offered a small, hesitant wave. Finn simply watched him, his gaze steady. Silas lifted a hand in return, a silent farewell. He watched as they were helped into the carriage, The door closed, sealing them back into their world of comfort and security. The woman paused before entering, turning back to him. "My debt remains," she said softly. "Should you ever need anything, send word to the estate." She looked at him one last time, a look that held understanding and respect. Then she too entered the carriage. With a signal from the lead servant, the horses began to move, the golden carriage turning, its wheels leaving tracks in the pristine snow as it began its journey back from the wilderness, back to the world of wealth and society. The sounds of its departure faded slowly, the jingling harnesses, the thud of hooves, until finally, the deep silence of the woods returned, settling around Silas once more. He stood in the clearing for a long time after they were gone, the pouch heavy in his hand, the silence vast around him. The cabin seemed smaller, colder, despite the fire he had built earlier. But it was different. The emptiness was familiar, yet it felt less absolute. He walked back inside, the scent of wood smoke and faintly, the lingering scent of the children, of warm bread and dried herbs, still in the air. He looked at the small, smooth stones on the floor, the tiny blanket he had fashioned for them. They were gone. The sudden, intense chapter of his life closed as abruptly as it had begun. He was alone again, but he was not the same man who had stumbled upon the burning cabin. The despair had receded, replaced by something quieter, more resilient. The hardship of his life remained, the biting cold, the gnawing hunger, the endless struggle. But he had faced an impossible task and, in his own way, he had succeeded. He had sheltered fragile lives, offered warmth from his own meager store, and in doing so, had found a core of strength he hadn't known he possessed. The world was still harsh, the woods still unforgiving, but he faced it now with a quiet dignity, a sense of having mattered, of having made a difference. The golden carriage had carried away its precious cargo, leaving him with wealth he had not sought, but also with a different kind of richness, an internal fortitude forged in the face of overwhelming odds. He was a poor woodsman no longer defined solely by his poverty, but by the quiet act of saving, and by the enduring resilience found in the deepest solitude. The promise of a future, however uncertain, felt less daunting now. He had faced the fire, the cold, and the impossible, and he had endured. He would continue to endure.